He used to be a man of authority, a figure who commanded respect. For years, he stood as a pillar of justice, leading the city's police force with a firm yet fair hand. But now, he found himself on the other side of the law, handcuffed, humiliated, and under arrest, all because of a simple, ugly assumption. The sun was barely setting over the streets of Oakland when it happened. It started as an ordinary day. He was on his way home, carrying a few groceries, when the flashing lights cut through the dusk and the siren wailed, drawing unwanted attention. As the squad car pulled up, 2 officers stepped out, one of them already sizing him up with a suspicious glare. "What's going on?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm, but there was a hint of confusion. One of the officers, a tall man with a cold stare, stepped forward. He wasn't interested in explanations. "We've got a report of a man fitting your description stealing from the store down the street," he said, without even checking any details. The accusation hit like a slap. He felt his heart race, not out of fear, but out of shock. He hadn't done anything. He had paid for his groceries, waved at the cashier he knew, and left without a second thought. Now, this stranger in a uniform was treating him like a common criminal, with a look that said he had already made up his mind. "Officer, you've got it wrong. I didn't steal anything," he replied, lifting his hand slightly, trying to defuse the situation. But his words were met with a smirk, a mocking smile that made his blood boil. "Oh, really?" the officer sneered, stepping closer. "You people always have an excuse, don't you?" There it was. The words were dripping with disdain, and it was clear to anyone watching what this was really about. It wasn't about a stolen item or a misunderstanding. It was about something deeper, uglier. But the officer didn't care. He already saw his suspect, and he was going to make sure everyone else saw him that way too. Before he could say another word, the officer grabbed his wrist and forced him against the car. The crowd that had started to gather could see everything, and the phones were already out, recording the scene as it unfolded. "You don't need to do this," he tried again, but the officer cut him off, twisting his arm harshly. "I said, you're under arrest. Hands behind your back, now," the officer barked, his voice loud enough for everyone around to hear. It wasn't just an arrest, it was a display, a show of power meant to humiliate, to strip away every ounce of dignity he had left. As the cuffs clicked shut, the officer leaned in close, his voice low but sharp. "You're just another thug pretending to be something you're not. Thought you could get away with it?" For a moment, he felt his knees weaken, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of the injustice pressing down on him. How could this be happening? He was no stranger to these streets, no nameless figure blending into the background. He was someone who had once stood in front of a podium, wearing a badge, commanding respect. But none of that mattered now. To this man, he was just another black face, and that was enough reason to treat him like less than nothing. As they pushed him into the back of the police car, the officer's partner, who had been silent up until now, leaned against the car, shaking his head slightly. "You sure about this, man? Maybe we should check." "I don't need to check anything," the officer snapped, cutting him off. "He's guilty. I can see it." The journey to the station was a blur. All he could think about was the faces in the crowd, the cameras pointed at him, the whispers that followed him all the way inside. They had stripped him of his dignity, his respect, and now they were parading him through the station like a trophy. But they didn't know who they had just put behind bars. Not yet. Inside the station, he was processed like any other suspect. Fingerprints, mugshots, the whole procedure. The officer who arrested him watched with a smug satisfaction, as if this was just another easy win for him, another chance to assert his power over someone he had already judged as guilty. But as the papers were processed and the hours ticked by, something began to shift. The whispers that had started as quiet murmurings grew louder, more frantic. A senior officer approached the desk where he was seated, confusion etched across his face. "What's he doing here?" the man asked, his voice low, almost as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. The arresting officer, still riding high on his perceived victory, glanced over with a careless shrug. Caught him trying to steal. He matches the description. The senior officer's eyes flicked from the man in cuffs to the one who had put him there. Do you have any idea who this is? And just like that, the room fell silent. The officers nearby stopped what they were doing, their heads turning, the air thick with unease. For a moment, the smugness on the arresting officer's face wavered, replaced with a flicker of doubt. What are you talking about? He asked, his voice a little less certain. The senior officer stepped forward, his eyes locking onto the arresting officers. You just arrested the former chief of police, he said, each word sharp and deliberate, cutting through the room like a knife. The officer's face went pale, his bravado crumbling as the realization hit him. This wasn't just another man he could push around, another statistic he could add to his record. This was someone who had once sat at the top, who had the power to end careers with a single call, and he had just made a colossal mistake. But it was too late to take it back now. The damage was done. Now, all eyes were on the man in the cuffs, the former chief, as he slowly stood, the cuffs still clinking softly around his wrists. His gaze was steady, unbroken, and the room could feel the shift in power. This was no longer about a wrongful arrest. It was about something bigger, a reckoning, a moment that would not be forgotten. The man who had been brought down, humiliated in front of everyone, was about to take back everything that had been stolen from him, and more. But how? What could he do, trapped in a system that had just betrayed him so deeply? And what would the officer do now that he realized the man he had tried to shame was far more powerful than he could have ever imagined? Stay tuned to see how a wrongful arrest turns into a battle for justice, where every move counts and the consequences are about to change everything. Will the former chief reclaim his dignity, or is this just the beginning of his downfall? Find out in the story that will keep you on the edge of your seat until the very last moment. Hey everyone, before we dive into today's story, I want to take a moment to address something important. At Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against all forms of racism and discrimination. We believe in equality, justice, and respect for all individuals, regardless of race or background. This channel is a space where everyone's story matters, and we are committed to bringing light to the struggles and triumphs that deserve to be heard. So, sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. And if you haven't already, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on more powerful narratives like this one. Thank you for being here, and let's get started. Oakland was a city of contrasts. On one side, vibrant murals and lively music spilled out of neighborhood bars, painting a picture of resilience and community. On the other, there were the heavy shadows cast by tall buildings, where whispers of distrust and tension lingered in the air. It was a city where dreams were chased and stolen, where hope was both a lifeline and a burden. This was the backdrop against which Malik Johnson had built his life, his career, and his reputation. Malik had grown up in Oakland, in a neighborhood where every kid learned to look over their shoulder before crossing the street. He was no stranger to the struggles that came with living there. But he had always been different. While others might have seen a dead end, he saw a path, and he walked it with determination. That determination had taken him all the way to the top. For years, Malik was known as Chief Johnson, the head of the city's police department. He wasn't just any chief, he was the first black man to hold the position in Oakland's history, and he wore that badge with pride. Malik had earned his respect, not just through his title, but through his actions. He was the kind of leader who didn't hide behind a desk. He was out on the streets, talking to the people, listening to their concerns. He knew the community, and the community knew him. It was never just about enforcing the law, it was about understanding why the law was broken in the first place. This approach had earned him allies and enemies alike. Some saw him as a bridge between the people and the system, while others thought he was too soft, too willing to bend the rules if it meant helping someone in need. But Malik never wavered. He believed that to serve was to protect, and to protect was to understand. After years of dedication, Malik had decided it was time to step down, to make way for new leadership. He'd done his part, and now he wanted to focus on his family, on being a husband and a father. For the first time in decades, he was starting to feel the weight lift off his shoulders. Retirement felt like a long exhale after holding his breath for years. But Oakland wasn't done with him yet. Darius Carter, on the other hand, was a different story. A young officer with a chip on his shoulder, he'd been on the force for a few years but carried himself like a veteran. Darius had a sharp jawline, a buzz cut that never seemed to grow out, and a gaze that was more piercing than inviting. To him, the badge was a symbol of power, and he wielded it like a weapon. He believed in the black and white view of justice: you were either right or wrong, good or bad, and there was no in-between. That kind of thinking made him efficient, but it also made him dangerous. Darius had a knack for making quick judgments, and once his mind was set, there was little that could change it. Darius had seen Malik's name on the plaques and heard the stories, but to him, Malik was just a relic of a different time, a man who had tried to make friends with criminals instead of locking them up. Darius didn't care about history or legacies, he cared about control. And on that particular evening, when Malik was just trying to pick up some groceries on his way home, Darius was looking for an opportunity to remind the streets who was in charge. The store was small, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's name. Malik had always liked that. He liked walking down the aisles, bumping into neighbors, catching up on their lives. But that evening, as he left the store, bag in hand, he noticed a patrol car parked just down the street. He didn't think much of it, cops were a common sight in Oakland. But then he heard the shout. "Hey! You there! Stop!" Malik turned, confused, as he saw Darius approaching. His first instinct was to smile, to greet the officer, but something about Darius's posture stopped him. The way Darius was walking, the tight grip on his flashlight, the way his eyes seemed to narrow as he got closer, it was clear this wasn't a casual encounter. "Can I help you, officer?" Malik asked, keeping his voice calm. He'd been in enough tense situations to know how to handle this. Darius didn't answer right away. He looked Malik up and down, like he was trying to match him to a description in his head. "We've got a report of a theft," he said finally, his tone sharp. "And you fit the description." Malik blinked, surprised. "I don't think that's right. I just came from the store. I paid for everything." He could feel the eyes of passers-by starting to focus on them, phones being raised discreetly to film. But Darius wasn't interested in explanations. "Sure you did," he said, the sarcasm dripping from every word. "Turn around and put your hands where I can see them." For a moment, Malik thought about refusing. He thought about telling Darius who he was, thought about calling someone from the department to clear this up. But something held him back. Maybe it was the look in Darius's eyes, the barely concealed contempt, or maybe it was the fear of what would happen if he resisted. So, he did as he was told, feeling the cold metal of the cuffs clamp around his wrists. "What are you doing?" Malik asked, his voice low but firm. "I'm telling you, there's been a mistake." Darius stepped closer, so close that Malik could smell the stale coffee on his breath. "I don't make mistakes," he said quietly, but loud enough for everyone around to hear. "And you're under arrest." The cuffs were tight, too tight, cutting into Malik's skin, but he didn't flinch. He just looked at Darius, trying to understand how things had gotten to this point. But Darius wasn't looking for understanding. He was looking for control. As they walked to the patrol car, Malik glanced around, seeing the familiar faces of his neighborhood looking back at him with confusion, shock, and a hint of fear. This was the same man they'd seen in uniform, the same man who had once represented everything good about the city's police force. And now he was being led away like a criminal. The ride to the station was silent, except for the occasional crackle of the police radio. Malik sat in the back, staring out the window, his mind racing. He thought about his family, about his friends, about the years he had spent trying to make a difference. And now, here he was, at the mercy of a system he had once tried to change from the inside. Darius didn't say another word until they arrived at the station. As he led Malik inside, he leaned in, his voice barely more than a whisper. "People like you think you can get away with anything," he said. "Not anymore." But Darius had no idea who he was dealing with. Malik wasn't just another face in the crowd. He was a man who had spent years navigating the complexities of power, a man who knew the system inside and out. And if Darius thought this was going to end quietly, he was in for a rude awakening. Because this was just the beginning. The fluorescent lights of the station flickered overhead, casting harsh, pale shadows on the gray walls. Malik was led through the familiar halls, now as a suspect, not as a leader. Every step felt surreal, as if he were watching someone else being dragged through the place he used to command. Officers he'd known for years glanced at him, some with confusion, others quickly averting their gaze. Malik could feel the weight of their stares, but what stung more was the silence. No one dared to speak up, no one dared to ask questions. Darius kept his grip tight on Malik's arm, guiding him through the station, straight past the main desk. "Take him to processing," he ordered, nodding to one of the younger officers, who looked uneasy, glancing between Darius and Malik. "Sir, are you sure?" the officer began, his voice uncertain, but Darius cut him off, his tone sharp. "I said take him to processing. I'll handle the paperwork myself." There was a finality in his voice, the kind that made it clear there was no room for debate. The younger officer hesitated for a moment, then did as he was told, leading Malik down the corridor. As Malik was led through the narrow, claustrophobic hallway, memories of his years in the department washed over him. He had walked these halls countless times, stopping to greet officers, to ask how their kids were, to make sure everyone was okay. Now, those same faces looked away, avoiding his eyes, afraid of what acknowledging him might mean for them. It was as if his years of service, his dedication, had vanished in an instant, replaced by the cold, metal cuffs around his wrists. Darius watched from a distance, his arms crossed, eyes fixed on Malik. He'd never had this kind of power over someone like Malik before, and he wasn't going to let it slip away. But there was a flicker of unease, a sense that he was pushing too hard, and he could feel the eyes of his colleagues on him, even if they didn't say anything. Inside the processing room, the young officer nervously fumbled with the paperwork, his hands shaking slightly. Malik noticed, and for a moment, the tension softened. "What's your name?" Malik asked quietly, his voice calm, almost gentle. The officer looked up, surprised by the question. "It's, Jackson, sir. Officer Jackson." Malik nodded, offering a small, reassuring smile. "You don't have to call me, sir, anymore, Jackson. Just Malik." Jackson swallowed, clearly uncomfortable. I'm sorry about this, Malik. I don't understand." "Neither do I," Malik replied, his smile fading. "But that's how it goes, isn't it? Sometimes you don't get to understand. You just have to go along with it." Before Jackson could respond, the door burst open, and Darius strode in, his expression unreadable. "That's enough chit-chat," he said, his voice flat. "Finish up here, and let's get this done." Jackson quickly finished the paperwork, and Darius stepped forward, unlocking the cuffs with a quick, forceful motion. Malik rubbed his wrists, feeling the tender, raw skin where the metal had pressed too tightly. "Do you even know why you're doing this?" Malik asked, his eyes meeting Darius's with a calm defiance. Darius stiffened, but he didn't look away. "I know exactly why I'm doing this," he said. "People like you think you can get away with anything because of who you are, because of what you were. But not anymore. People like me." Malik repeated, his tone challenging. "What do you mean by that?" Darius didn't respond. Instead, he turned away, signaling that the conversation was over. But Malik wasn't done. "You don't even know who I am, do you? You think you have me figured out, but you have no idea. Darius paused, his jaw clenched, as if he were fighting back a response. For a moment, the room was silent, the tension thick enough to choke on. Then he turned back, his eyes cold. I know enough. The room was small, almost suffocating, and Malik could see the lines beginning to blur in Darius's expression. He had pushed hard, and now there was a hint of uncertainty, as if Darius was starting to realize that this might be more complicated than he'd thought. But there was no going back now. He'd already made his move, and Malik was going to make sure he played his next one very carefully. Back in the main office, the atmosphere was electric. Word of Malik's arrest had spread quickly, and whispers echoed through the station. Some officers were on edge, glancing at Darius with a mix of curiosity and unease. Others kept their heads down, pretending not to notice. But one voice, louder than the rest, broke through the murmur. What the hell is going on here? Captain Renee Thompson, a tall, no-nonsense woman with years of experience, walked in, her expression a mixture of confusion and anger. She had known Malik for years, had worked alongside him, and she wasn't about to let this slide without an explanation. She caught Darius's eye, and he immediately braced himself. Captain, Darius began, but Renee held up a hand, silencing him. I don't want excuses. I want answers, she snapped, turning to Malik. What is this all about? Why is my former boss being treated like a suspect? Malik met her gaze, and for a moment, he felt a flicker of hope. Renee was someone he could trust, someone who might be able to see through this mess. But Darius wasn't going to let that happen. He was caught shoplifting, Captain, Darius said, his voice steady, but there was a slight edge to it, a hint of desperation. I had probable cause. Renee's eyes narrowed, and she looked back at Malik. Is that true? Malik could see the disbelief in her eyes, and he shook his head slowly. No, it's not true. And he knows it. Darius stepped forward, his frustration boiling over. I have witnesses, Captain. I saw him leave the store without paying, and he matches the description. This is my call, and I'm following procedure. Renee didn't say anything for a moment, just stared at Darius, her expression unreadable. Then she sighed, as if she were tired of the whole charade. I don't care what you think you saw, she said finally. You're talking about a man who served this city for decades. You don't get to treat him like this without solid evidence. The room went silent, and Malik could feel the tension shift. Darius had overplayed his hand, and now he was scrambling to keep control. But Malik wasn't going to make it easy for him. I want to see the footage, Malik said quietly. If I'm guilty, it should be clear, right? Let's see the proof. Darius hesitated, and for the first time, Malik saw the cracks forming. The confidence that had driven his actions was slipping, replaced by something else, something that looked a lot like fear. Darius stammered, searching for the right words, but they wouldn't come. That won't be necessary. Renee raised an eyebrow. Oh, I think it will be. I want to see what happened, and I want to see it now. As Darius struggled to maintain his composure, Malik felt a surge of determination. This was his chance, a moment to expose the truth, to make it clear that this wasn't just about a misunderstanding or a mistake. It was about something deeper, something that had been festering for far too long. But Darius wasn't ready to give up. You're making a mistake, he said, his voice low, almost pleading. He's not who you think he is. No, Malik said, stepping forward, his eyes locked on Darius's. I'm exactly who you think I am. And that's what scares you, isn't it? The room was still, everyone waiting to see what would happen next. Darius looked around, searching for support, but he found none. And Malik could see it now, the realization dawning on Darius's face, that he was losing control, that the narrative he had tried to create was slipping through his fingers. But this was far from over. Malik could feel the storm brewing, the tension rising, and he knew that when it broke, it would change everything. He just needed to hold on a little longer, to let the truth speak for itself. Because what was coming next would be more than just a revelation, it would be a reckoning. And Darius had no idea how close he was to losing everything. The silence in the room was suffocating. Malik stood there, his eyes fixed on Darius, who was still trying to piece together a way out of the mess he had created. Around them, the other officers shuffled uncomfortably, their eyes darting between Malik, Darius, and Captain Rene. It was as if the entire station was holding its breath, waiting for what would come next. Malik's heart was steady now, the anger that had simmered quietly beneath the surface beginning to rise, controlled yet powerful. He had spent his life finding ways to navigate tense situations, but this was different. This wasn't just a matter of pride, this was about exposing a lie that cut deeper than any accusation. Rene, who had been watching Darius carefully, finally broke the silence. "Darius, you're going to show us the footage," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Now." Darius's eyes flickered, a hint of panic creeping in. "Captain, no excuses," she interrupted, cutting him off. "You've made a serious accusation against a man who has given everything to this city. If you're so sure of what you saw, then let's see it. Otherwise, I want this situation rectified immediately." The tension in the room grew, but Malik said nothing. He wanted to see how far Darius was willing to take this, how deep he would dig his own grave. He watched as Darius's jaw clenched, the muscles in his face tightening as he struggled to maintain his composure. He had come too far, and he was too proud to back down now. With a slight tremor in his hands, Darius reached for the remote and clicked a few buttons. The security monitor on the wall flickered, and the grainy footage from the grocery store began to play. For a few moments, there was nothing but mundane images of shoppers moving up and down the aisles. Then Malik appeared on the screen, calm, composed, selecting a few items and placing them in his basket. The footage was clear, there was no confusion, no hesitation in his movements. He walked to the counter, paid for his things, and left the store with a small wave to the cashier. The room watched in silence, the truth playing out before their eyes. As the clip ended, Rene's eyes shifted back to Darius. "I don't see anything there that warrants an arrest," she said, her voice carrying a steely edge. "What do you see, Officer Carter?" Darius was cornered, and he knew it. His mind raced, searching for an explanation that would save him from the inevitable backlash. It's not just about the footage," he stammered, his voice losing its previous confidence. "He was acting suspiciously outside the store. I thought he was trying to avoid being seen. I was just following up on a report." Rene's expression darkened, and she took a step closer, her eyes locked onto Darius's. "Following up on a report," she echoed, her tone dripping with disbelief. "Or were you looking for an excuse to assert your authority? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you targeted a man without cause, without evidence, and then you dragged him here in front of everyone to make a statement." Darius opened his mouth to protest, but no words came out. Malik could see it now, the facade cracking, the truth beginning to bleed through. But it wasn't enough. "Not yet." "Captain," Malik said, his voice breaking the tension. "There's more to this than just a false accusation. This is about the kind of culture we've allowed to grow unchecked. It's not just about one officer overstepping his bounds. It's about the power that's being abused, the prejudice that's being masked as procedure. And it's time we address it." Darius turned sharply, his face flushed with a mix of anger and desperation. "You're trying to turn this into something it's not," he snapped, his voice loud, defensive. "You think you can use your old connections, your reputation, to make me look like the bad guy here. But you're not in charge anymore, Johnson. I'm not going to back down just because you think you can intimidate me." Malik's eyes narrowed, but he remained calm. "Intimidate you?" he repeated softly. "You think that's what this is about?" "I don't need to intimidate you, Darius. The truth will do that on its own. Darius took a step closer, his posture aggressive, but Malik didn't flinch. You don't scare me, Darius said, his voice low, almost a growl. You're just another man trying to cling to power he doesn't have anymore. You're nothing. Malik's expression softened, almost as if he pitied Darius. That's where you're wrong, he said quietly. This isn't about power. It's about accountability. Something you clearly don't understand. The words hit harder than any physical blow could have, and for a moment, Darius faltered, his bravado slipping away. The room was silent, everyone watching, waiting to see what would happen next. And then, just as Darius was about to speak, the door to the station opened, and a new figure stepped in. It was Deputy Mayor Howard, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a stern face and sharp eyes. He had been following the situation from the sidelines, and now he had decided to step in. I think we need to have a serious conversation, he said, his voice carrying across the room. Renee turned to face him, surprised. Deputy Mayor, I didn't realize you were here. Howard nodded, his gaze shifting to Malik, then to Darius. I was nearby when I heard what was happening, and I decided to come by. It seems like things have gotten a bit out of hand, don't you think? Darius straightened up, trying to salvage his authority. Sir, I was just, enough, Howard interrupted, holding up a hand. I've seen the footage, and I've heard enough. This is not how we conduct ourselves, especially not in this city. Malik Johnson is a respected figure, and even if he wasn't, he deserves the same fairness and dignity as anyone else. What I'm seeing here is a failure, not just of judgment, but of integrity. Darius's face went pale, the reality of the situation sinking in. Howard continued, his tone unyielding. Officer Carter, you will be placed on administrative leave effective immediately. An investigation will be conducted, and if it's found that you acted inappropriately, there will be consequences. Darius opened his mouth to protest, but no sound came out. His eyes darted around the room, searching for support, but he found none. The other officers, the ones who had once stood by his side, now looked away, unwilling to be dragged down with him. Deputy Mayor, with all due respect, this isn't fair, Darius tried again, but Howard cut him off. What isn't fair, Howard said, his voice rising, is that an innocent man was dragged through the mud because you couldn't see past your own prejudice. This isn't about justice, it's about ego. And it's going to stop, right now. The weight of those words hung in the air, and Malik could see the shift happening, the power that Darius had tried to wield crumbling before him. But this wasn't the end, it was just the beginning of the reckoning Malik had been waiting for. Deputy Mayor, if I may, Malik said, stepping forward. I appreciate your intervention, but there's something more I need to say. This incident is not an isolated case. It's part of a pattern that has gone unchallenged for too long. I have evidence, testimonies, from others who have been mistreated, profiled, and abused by this system. This isn't just about me. It's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. The room fell silent again, but this time it was different. There was no tension, no hostility. Just the quiet, steady realization that something much larger was unfolding. Howard nodded slowly. I'm listening, he said. Go on. Malik took a deep breath, feeling the weight of years of silence lifting off his shoulders. I have files, recordings, evidence that shows how certain officers have been using their positions to intimidate, to harass, and to target people of color. I kept these records because I hoped things would change, that we could address these issues internally. But it's clear that hasn't happened. So now, I'm bringing it to light. Darius's eyes widened, and for the first time, he looked truly afraid. You can't do this, he whispered, his voice barely audible. You'll ruin everything. Malik turned to face him, his expression resolute. No, Darius. You ruined everything the moment you thought you could treat people like they were beneath you, like their dignity didn't matter. This isn't about revenge. It's about justice. Howard stepped forward, his face stern. Then let's get to the bottom of this. Malik, if what you're saying is true, we will ensure that those responsible are held accountable. This ends today. As Howard spoke, Malik could see the storm he had been waiting for finally breaking. The truth, long buried, was beginning to emerge, and with it came the promise of change. Darius had wanted to assert his power, to prove that he could control the narrative. But in doing so, he had exposed the very thing he had been trying to hide. And now, Malik was ready to take back everything that had been stolen from him, not just his dignity, but the chance to make a real, lasting difference. This was no longer just about one man's wrongful arrest. It was about dismantling a system that had allowed prejudice to thrive unchecked. Darius stood there, defeated, his future slipping away as Malik, Renee, and Howard prepared to do what he never could, deliver true justice. And as the truth began to unfold, the entire city of Oakland was about to witness a reckoning it would never forget. The room was buzzing, not with noise, but with a silent, electric tension. Malik stood at the center, feeling the weight of every eye in the station on him. This was a moment he hadn't planned for, but now that it was here, he felt the sense of purpose rising within him. For years, he had worked within the system, trying to change it from the inside, hoping that understanding and compassion could bridge the gaps. But now, as he stood there, facing Darius and the other officers, he realized that change wouldn't come quietly. It had to be demanded. Malik, Renee said softly, her voice a rare moment of warmth amid the cold tension. If you're ready, we're here to listen. He nodded, glancing briefly at Howard, who gave him a silent, reassuring nod. This was it. There was no turning back. Years ago, when I first took on the role of chief, I did it because I believed that the police could be more than just enforcers. We could be protectors, guides. But there's a difference between enforcing the law and abusing it, Malik began, his voice steady but laced with emotion. I've seen too many cases where officers overstep, where assumptions are made not based on evidence, but on bias. And I tried to address it quietly, diplomatically. But diplomacy only works when both sides are willing to listen. Malik turned his gaze to Darius, who stood rigid, like a man preparing for impact. You didn't want to listen, Darius. You wanted to control. And today, when you saw me, you saw an opportunity to exercise that control. You thought I was just another man you could put in cuffs and parade through this station without a second thought. But you miscalculated. Not just about who I am, but about what this department could tolerate. Darius's face tightened, his hands clenching into fists. You think you're better than me, he said, his voice shaking. You think just because you were chief, you can lecture me about how to do my job. But you're not chief anymore, Malik. You're just a man who got caught doing something wrong. I'm not here to lecture you, Darius. I'm here to hold you accountable, Malik said, his eyes hardening. You think I don't understand what it's like out there? I grew up in these streets. I've seen what happens when the people who are supposed to protect us forget that their job isn't to instill fear, but to build trust. And I've also seen what happens when someone abuses their power. You wanted to make an example out of me. Well, I'm going to make an example out of you. Darius took a step forward, his expression defiant, but there was a tremor in his voice that betrayed his fear. You have no right to do this. You think dragging my name through the mud is going to make things better? It's just going to make things worse. You're stirring up trouble where there doesn't need to be any. Renee stepped in, her voice sharp. Enough, Darius. Malik is right. This isn't just about today. It's about the culture we've allowed to grow in this department. And if you don't see that, then you're part of the problem. Darius's eyes flashed with anger. You're all against me. You're all, stop. Malik's voice cut through the room like a blade. This isn't about you, Darius. It never was. It's about every person who's been stopped on the street for no reason, every kid who's been treated like a criminal because of the color of their skin, every parent who has to teach their child to be afraid of the people who are supposed to keep them safe. This ends now. Howard stepped forward, taking control of the moment. Malik, you mentioned evidence. You said you've been collecting records. We need to see it. The city needs to see it. If we're going to make real changes, we need to face this problem head-on. Malik hesitated for a moment, then nodded. I didn't want to have to do this. I wanted to believe that things could get better without exposing the worst of it. But after what happened today, I don't see another way. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small USB drive. Everything I've gathered over the years is on this. Recordings of meetings, testimonies from community members, reports that were buried because they were inconvenient. It's all there. The room seemed to hold its breath as Howard took the drive from Malik's hand. This is serious, he said, his voice quiet but firm. And if what you're saying is true, it's going to cause a lot of backlash. Are you prepared for that? Malik met his gaze without hesitation. I'm prepared for whatever comes. Because if we don't fix this now, we're just waiting for the next tragedy, the next Darius to step in and make the same mistakes. Darius's face twisted, a mix of anger, fear, and desperation. You think you can just ruin my career, my life, because of one mistake, he said, his voice rising. I was doing my job. I was trying to keep the streets safe. You weren't trying to keep anyone safe, Darius, Renee said, her voice cold. You were trying to assert your dominance, and you got caught. And now you're going to face the consequences. For a moment, it seemed as though Darius might lash out, but then he slumped, the fight draining out of him. He looked around the room, seeing the faces of his colleagues, once allies, now turned away from him. I did what I thought was right, he whispered, but even he didn't seem to believe it anymore. Malik took a step closer, his voice softening but still strong. There's a difference between doing what's right and doing what's easy. It's easy to throw someone in cuffs and say it's for their own good. It's easy to make assumptions and let your prejudice guide your actions. But it's not right. And it's not justice. Howard turned to the other officers in the room, his expression grave. This is going to be a long process, and it's not going to be pretty. But if we're serious about making this department better, it starts with us. It starts with facing the hard truths, no matter how uncomfortable they are. There was a murmur of agreement, quiet but growing. For the first time, Malik felt a glimmer of hope. This was what he had been fighting for, the reason he had stayed silent for so long, gathering evidence, trying to build a case that couldn't be ignored. And now, finally, people were listening. Darius, however, wasn't ready to give up completely. You think this is over, he said, his voice barely more than a whisper, but still filled with venom. You think you've won? No, Malik said, shaking his head. This isn't about winning or losing. It's about justice. It's about making sure that people like you can't keep using your badge as a weapon. And if that means you lose your job, then that's a consequence of your own actions. The words hit Darius like a final blow, and he stumbled back, as if the weight of everything was finally crashing down on him. For a moment, he looked lost, like a man who had spent his whole life fighting for control, only to realize too late that he had never really had it. Howard cleared his throat, bringing the room back to focus. Officer Carter, you're to be escorted out of this building immediately. An internal investigation will be launched, and if Malik's evidence proves accurate, further actions will be taken. Captain Thompson, I trust you'll handle this appropriately. Renee nodded, her expression resolute. I will. We've let things slide for too long, and that changes today. As two officers stepped forward to lead Darius away, he didn't resist. He just let them guide him out, his shoulders slumped, his eyes vacant. The man who had strutted into the station, so sure of his power, was gone, replaced by someone who finally understood what it felt like to be powerless. As Darius disappeared down the hallway, Howard turned back to Malik. "I don't know how this is all going to play out, Malik," he said. "But I want you to know that I'm proud of you. It takes courage to stand up, especially when it would be easier to stay silent." Malik felt a lump rise in his throat, but he pushed it down, nodding. "It shouldn't have to take courage, though. It should just be the right thing to do." Howard smiled faintly. "Maybe so. But the right thing isn't always easy. You've shown this city what it means to fight for justice, even when it's not convenient. And that's something they're not going to forget." As the room began to clear, Malik stood there, feeling the tension begin to lift, replaced by a sense of relief, of hope. This wasn't the end of the fight. It was just the beginning. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he wasn't fighting alone. As he looked around at the faces of the officers who were still there, he saw something he hadn't seen in a long time: respect. Not just for the man he used to be, but for the man he still was, the man who had refused to back down, even when everything was stacked against him. And as he stepped out of the station, into the warm Oakland night, he allowed himself a small smile. There was still work to be done, still battles to be fought. But for now, he had won a small victory. And sometimes, that was enough to change everything. The cold night air hit Malik's face as he stepped out of the station, but he barely felt it. His mind was racing, the adrenaline still pumping through his veins. He had done it, he had stood up, he had spoken out, and for the first time in a long while, he felt like he had made a real difference. But he also knew this was just the beginning. The consequences of what had happened today would ripple out across the entire city, and not everyone would be ready for the change that was coming. The next morning, the story had already spread. News outlets were buzzing, headlines flashing Malik's name alongside words like controversy, accountability, and systemic reform. Clips of his confrontation with Darius had been leaked, showing Malik's calm, determined voice cutting through the tension, exposing the flaws that had been ignored for too long. The city was talking, and this time, it wasn't going to be a quiet conversation. Malik sat in his kitchen, sipping a cup of coffee, trying to process everything that had happened. The morning sun filtered through the blinds, casting long, slanted shadows across the table. His phone buzzed non-stop, messages of support from old colleagues, friends, and even people he hadn't heard from in years. But mixed in were messages of a different tone, less supportive, more confrontational. Not everyone was happy about what he had done. "Have you seen the news?" Malik's wife, Vanessa, walked in, her face a mix of concern and pride. She was holding her phone, showing him an article with a headline that read, "Former Police Chief Exposes Systemic Issues, The Fight for Reform Begins." Malik glanced at the screen and then back at her. "I've seen it," he said quietly. "I just didn't expect it to happen so fast." Vanessa sat down across from him, her eyes softening. "You did what had to be done, Malik. You've been holding on to this for too long, trying to fix things quietly. But sometimes, you need to make noise to be heard." He nodded, but there was a weight in his chest that wouldn't go away. "I know, but there's going to be pushback. Darius isn't the only one who's going to be affected by this. There are people who don't want this to come to light. People who will do anything to protect the status quo." Vanessa reached out, taking his hand. "Then let them. Let them fight it. Because now, everyone's watching. And they can't ignore it anymore." Malik squeezed her hand, drawing strength from her words. She was right. There was no turning back, and he didn't want to. But as he thought about the days ahead, he couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to get much more complicated. By midday, the city was buzzing with tension. Local news channels had parked their vans outside the police headquarters, waiting for any new developments. The footage of Malik's confrontation with Darius had gone viral, sparking debates online, in cafes, in homes across Oakland. People were angry. Some were furious that such behavior had been exposed, others were furious that it had taken so long for someone to speak up. At the station, the mood was different. Officers moved through the halls with a mix of uncertainty and apprehension. Darius's desk had been cleared out, his nameplate removed, a visible reminder of the shift that was happening. But the real unease came from not knowing what was next. Would Malik's evidence lead to more suspensions, more firings? Would there be protests? Riots? The air was thick with unanswered questions. Captain Renee Thompson was in her office, staring at the USB drive Malik had given to Howard the day before. She hadn't slept much, her mind replaying the events over and over, trying to grasp the full scope of what was happening. She knew Malik was right, that the department needed to change, but she also knew that change like this wouldn't come easily. There would be resistance, and not just from officers like Darius. There was a knock on her door, and Howard stepped in, looking as serious as she felt. "Renee," he said, closing the door behind him. "We need to talk." She motioned for him to sit, but he remained standing. "I just got off the phone with the mayor. He's concerned. He wants to know how far this is going to go." Renee met his gaze, trying to read between the lines. "What does that mean, exactly?" Howard sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It means he's worried this could spiral out of control. That if we dig too deep, we're going to find things that people don't want found. And that could lead to lawsuits, protests, maybe even calls for a complete overhaul of the department." Renee nodded slowly, understanding the implications. "So what's he asking us to do? Sweep it under the rug? Pretend this didn't happen?" "No," Howard said, his voice firm. "That's not going to happen. We're going to address this, but we need to be strategic about it. We need to make sure that whatever changes we implement are done the right way, without causing more chaos." Renee leaned back in her chair, letting out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. "I'm with you, Howard. But we can't afford to be too cautious. We can't let the fear of backlash stop us from doing what needs to be done. Malik brought this to light because he believed we could do better. We owe it to him, and to this city, to see this through." Howard nodded, a small smile forming on his lips. "I knew you'd say that. And I agree. Which is why I'm going to back Malik's findings. We're going to launch a full investigation, and we're going to make sure that everyone understands that this isn't about targeting individuals. It's about fixing a broken system." As he spoke, Renee felt a flicker of hope. It was going to be a long, difficult road, but for the first time, she felt like they were moving in the right direction. "I'll make the announcements," she said, standing up. "And I'll talk to the officers. They need to hear this from someone they trust." Howard nodded, turning to leave. "Good. And Renee, thank you. I know this isn't easy." "Nothing worth doing ever is," she replied, watching him go. Meanwhile, Malik found himself in a different kind of conversation. He had been invited to speak at a community center that evening, to address the growing concerns and to explain what had happened. As he stood on the small stage, looking out at the sea of faces, he felt a wave of emotions crash over him. This was his city, these were his people, and they deserved to know the truth. "Thank you for coming," he began, his voice echoing softly through the room. "I'm not here to make excuses, or to offer easy answers. I'm here because something happened yesterday that shouldn't have happened. And I'm not just talking about my arrest. I'm talking about what led to it. About a culture that allows good people to be treated like criminals, and bad behavior to be overlooked because it's inconvenient to address." He paused, letting his words sink in, watching as the expressions on the faces before him shifted from anger to understanding. "I'm not here to tear down the police. I'm here to rebuild it. To make sure that when we say we protect and serve, we mean it. And that means facing the ugly truth, no matter how much it hurts." From the back of the room, a voice called out. "But what's going to change? We've heard these promises before, and nothing ever changes." Malik took a deep breath, nodding. "You're right. Change doesn't come from words alone. It comes from action. That's why I've handed over evidence to the city, evidence that shows exactly where we've failed. And I'm not just going to stand back and watch. I'm going to be involved, every step of the way, to make sure that we don't just talk about change. We make it happen. The room erupted in applause, and as Malik stood there, he felt the weight on his shoulders lighten, just a little. There were still so many battles to be fought, but he was ready. For the first time, it felt like he wasn't fighting alone. As the applause died down, Malik raised his hand, signaling for quiet. I know some of you are scared, angry, unsure of what comes next. But I need you to believe in this. Believe that we can be better. Because if we don't, then nothing will change. And I'm not willing to accept that. Not anymore. He stepped off the stage, and as he did, people began to surround him, shaking his hand, offering words of support. Vanessa was there, her eyes bright with pride, and she wrapped him in a tight hug. You did it, she whispered. You're doing it. Malik smiled, but he knew it was far from over. The investigation, the reforms, the backlash, it was all still ahead. But as he stood there, surrounded by the people who had once seen him as just another face in a uniform, he realized that this was exactly where he needed to be. He didn't know what the future would bring, but he knew one thing for certain. The fight for justice, for real, lasting change, had finally begun. And this time, there was no going back. The months that followed Malik's confrontation with Darius and the exposure of systemic issues within the police department were nothing short of transformative. The investigation launched by Deputy Mayor Howard unearthed more than anyone had expected, patterns of abuse, corruption, and negligence that had festered under the surface for years. Officers who had used their badges to intimidate rather than protect were brought to light, and some, like Darius, were removed from the force entirely. Darius's career unraveled rapidly. The investigation found that Malik's case was not an isolated incident. Darius had a history of similar behavior, using minor infractions as excuses to exert his authority. It became clear that his actions weren't about law enforcement but about control, prejudice, and power. The evidence was undeniable, and he was left with no choice but to resign in disgrace. As he walked out of the station for the last time, he realized the extent of his loss. What he thought was a display of strength had only exposed his weakness, and now, there was nothing left to hide behind. The finality of it all was crushing, his career, his reputation, his sense of purpose, all stripped away because of his own actions. For Captain Renee Thompson, the investigation was a turning point. She had always been committed to her job, but now she had the chance to do more than just keep things running smoothly. She was appointed to lead a new task force aimed at reforming the department from within. It was a daunting task, but she was ready. She worked alongside Malik and other community leaders to establish new protocols, focusing on transparency, accountability, and building trust with the people of Oakland. It wasn't an easy process, but every small victory felt like a step in the right direction. For the first time, she felt like the department could truly live up to the values it claimed to uphold. Malik's life changed in ways he hadn't anticipated. He became a symbol, not just of resistance, but of hope. His actions had sparked a movement, and people from all over the city, from all walks of life, reached out to thank him, to share their stories, and to join the fight for change. But Malik wasn't interested in fame or recognition. What mattered to him was that people were finally being heard. The reforms that were implemented weren't just cosmetic. They included new training programs, community outreach initiatives, and policies that made it clear that misconduct would not be tolerated. Malik, though not officially part of the department anymore, played a crucial role in shaping these changes. He worked closely with Renee, Howard, and community leaders to ensure that the reforms weren't just words on paper but real, actionable steps. One evening, several months after the initial incident, Malik found himself back at the community center, this time as part of a celebration. The task force had just passed a series of reforms that would significantly improve how the department operated, and it felt like a victory worth savoring. As he stood on the stage, looking out at the crowd, he couldn't help but reflect on how far they had come. Change doesn't happen overnight, he began, his voice steady, carrying the weight of everything they had been through. It takes patience, persistence, and a willingness to confront the uncomfortable truths. But today, we proved that it's possible. We took the first steps, and I know we have a long way to go, but I believe in this city. I believe in its people. The applause was deafening, and as Malik stepped down from the stage, Vanessa was there to greet him, her smile warm and proud. "I knew you could do it," she whispered, and for the first time in a long while, Malik felt like he could breathe. Deputy Mayor Howard approached him, a rare smile on his usually stern face. "You've done something incredible, Malik. I hope you know that." Malik nodded, feeling a mix of pride and relief. "I didn't do it alone. None of us did. But we've set something in motion, and now we have to make sure it keeps going." Howard clapped him on the shoulder. "And we will. Together." As the night went on, Malik mingled with the crowd, talking, laughing, and listening. For so long, he had been fighting to be heard, to make a difference, and now he could see the results of that struggle in the faces around him. There was still work to be done, but this was a victory he would carry with him. The next morning, as the sun rose over Oakland, Malik sat by the window with a cup of coffee, looking out at the city he had dedicated his life to. It wasn't perfect, but it was his, and now, it felt like it was finally moving in the right direction. He had reclaimed his dignity, his purpose, and more than that, he had helped to build something better, not just for himself, but for everyone. Sometimes, the hardest battles aren't the ones fought in the streets but the ones fought within systems that are meant to protect us. Malik's story isn't just about one man's struggle, it's about the power of standing up, even when it feels like the world is against you. It's about pushing for change, even when the odds aren't in your favor. How many times have we seen injustices brushed under the rug because confronting them would be too uncomfortable? How many times have people been silenced when they tried to speak out? But here's what Malik's story shows us: change is possible. It's difficult, it's messy, but it can be done. And it starts with courage, with refusing to stay silent, and with demanding accountability from those who hold power. What would you have done in Malik's shoes? Would you have had the strength to stand up, knowing the backlash could be intense, knowing that you might be standing alone? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear how this story resonates with you, and what it made you feel. And if you found this story as powerful and inspiring as we did, make sure to subscribe to Tales of Twist. We're committed to bringing you stories that challenge, that uplift, and that remind us all of the power of resilience. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. Thanks for being with us on this journey, and we'll see you next time.